Zach, we are back, and it is time to start talking about some rebuilding strategies heading into the tail end of 2023. I know we're still a little ahead of the back half, but some teams are already looking at 2024. We're here to help. And with that said, I do hope you'll enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your thoughts. What questions do you have about rebuilding? And if you need more help rebuilding, there's no better place to go than patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that Patreon Discord. Ton of people in there ready, raring to help you guys. We're in there ready to help you guys as well. With all of that said, the first discussion we have to get into when we're talking about rebuilding, and this is something you need to know pretty much in any league format you're in at all times. You should be knowing this, but it's easy to get left by the wayside, especially if you're in multiple leagues. Just simple knowing your league settings, your starting requirements, how rookie draft order is decided, things like that. Know what players and what player archetypes score well in that league format, because every league format is going to be different. Some players that are PPR monsters in other leagues just won't play well in others. One thing you can do, look at the competitive teams in your league and see if you can't somehow replicate what they're doing. Obviously, you're not going to be able to just, hey, man, can I have your team? But see what players do well in that scoring system for those teams and utilize the success of others in your league to further create your own success. That's what a rebuild is all about. So you're rebuilding for a reason. This is a chance to kind of start over, do it right, and analyze, is it because you just built poorly in the first place, not building off scoring settings? Is it because you made bad trades or bad draft picks? Make fixing those processes that got you where you are a focus going forward as needed. Zach, feel free to touch on this point at all, or feel free to dive into your first strategy beyond the bare minimum that we have to do when we're in a rebuild.
Just to kind of echo what you're saying, I think it's really important to know the nuances of the scoring system too, right? There are a lot of
Sure.
leagues where like kick return yards and punt return yards count,
Yes.
right? Which makes other players valuable, like a Donovan
Mhm.
Peoples-Jones, who's a returner, where running backs get yards for or points for first downs, or they get points per carry. Like these are nuances that you need to know because, like you said, does this scoring system make this position more valuable than a normal setting? Whereas, typically in these videos, we're talking Superflex, PPR, tight end premium formats, but those things can sway the conversation one way or the other. So know those things, but know the nuances of the scoring systems as well.
Great addition, Zach. I love the focus of, paying attention to those little minute things. Those little minute things add up, especially over the course of a season. But Zach, why don't you dive on in to your first strategy, talking rebuilds?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you know me. I'm loud. I'm not scared to get in your
God, I
face
know it.
and let you know. So for me, this seems it seems so obvious, but some people don't do it, and it's let it be known to the league publicly and privately that you're not contending this year. There's one league where I have a team that's not me, but another team in the league that's literally named Built for 2025. I know where that team stands, right? I know where that team's head is at for this year and next year because they're building for 2025. They're not building for 2024. So do things like that to let people know where your team stands. I'm going to use this analogy. You need to be the pharmacy to their wounds, right?
I love
Like
this.
if somebody has, in metaphorically speaking, on their fantasy team, they run out there, they're on roller skates, and they fall and scratch up their knee. They need to know where the infirmary is, and you are that infirmary. You need to be. I got your Adam Thielen right here, buddy. Let's just look at last week. Justin Jefferson, IR. Devon Achane, IR. Who's gonna have the resources to fill those 4 weeks? You are. And people need to know that. And you know what's going to happen is they're going to go, damn, Justin Jefferson just got hurt. I need someone for the next 4 weeks. Where do I go? And I know that this one team is rebuilding. I know that their players are available. They will listen at the right price. Let me go there first. Now, you may not get a deal done, but they will go to you first. And that is always important. We always talk about being the first one there, Bob. If you're not first, you're last in fantasy football. People need to know where to go. A great trade that just happened in one of my leagues to the team that had Justin Jefferson, they traded for Adam Thielen, and they traded a 24 second and third round pick. Makes sense for the team that just needs somebody for 4 weeks. Makes sense for the team that doesn't need Adam Thielen. They get points off their roster. They get 2 draft picks. And you know what? I know for 100% certainty, Bob, the team that lost Justin Jefferson went right to that team that had Adam Thielen, and they got a deal done. So you got to let people know publicly and privately in your league chat and DMs that, hey, maybe not now, but if anything, if you get an injury, let me know. I got pieces you might be interested in, and they will remember that, and that's really important to kickstarting the rebuild. Whether it's 1 or 2 years, people need to know where to go when they need a player.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. I think there's some because I rarely am that person that will tell you exactly what I'm doing. And that's just how I am versus how you are. And there's nothing wrong with either way. But I think this is a great point, like you said, because you establish yourself as kind of the person to go to, the quote unquote dealer of the league, if you want to take the pharmacy analogy that much further towards places we probably shouldn't. But moving on from that poor analogy, I like the concept here a good bit. And especially if you are making the decision after a rough first 5 weeks or 6 weeks by the time this video comes out, if you're making that decision to actively turn to a rebuild, you have some pieces that may still be competitive. If you're in the second year of a rebuild or, 1 year removed from starting a rebuild, you might not have a ton of pieces that you can kind of throw out to help teams that are still competitive, but you might. That's just something to consider. Be the team that can heal the wounds, that can fix their problem. If you can fix their problem and you're, like you said, branded as that team that is, hey, I'm not looking for this year. If you need help, let me help you. Then you help me in return with draft picks. I think it's a great move. I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. Anything else to add, Zach?
I didn't know what other analogy to use. I was trying to think of like
like it.
I was trying to think of a national grocery chain, and I couldn't. Like, we have Publix here, but there's something else where you live, Bob, that we don't have here. So there's nothing universal. So I had to use a pharmacy.
I love it, Zach. I saw this on the show sheet and I was like, I am such a fan of that. So be the pharmacy to your league mates if you are rebuilding. Help them fix their wounds. Slap that Band-Aid on with an Adam Thielen or such and such name if you have them kicking around. Speaking of kicking around, you need to kick around on your dynasty roster and your rebuild. You need to allocate what each asset is to that rebuild. So who's worth holding, who needs to be moved on from, what players are worth stashing, which have long-term upside, etc. How are you divvying up what players go where on your roster? And this can be really daunting when you start a rebuild because you have 25 to 30 players plus. Some leagues are crazy like me and have commissioners that will let you roster up to 40 players that you don't have a clue what to do with. So, and this is something that implementing this practice can give you a direction. And that's the one thing with a rebuild that is probably one of the hardest things, because I think we've discussed it on the channel before. If you rebuild without a direction and you're just, well, trade everybody for draft picks, that's not really the way to properly necessarily rebuild. But implementing this can give you that direction and get you started when you might not know where to start. So the first thing you do, grab a pen, grab paper, whatever you need to do, write out these categories: core players, stashes, utility players, waiver wire fodder, trade pieces, any other categories you can think of. But basically, core players should be players that we want to build around for the long term. Players that, like the CeeDee Lambs, the Garrett Wilsons, these, young wide receivers that are going to outlast a rebuild, that are very talented and in reasonably okay situations. If we have those guys, we want to hold on to them. We want to keep them. Stashes are going to be players who haven't done much but have shown some promise. These are usually, rookies, sophomores, guys that maybe belong on a taxi squad, but they can turn into core players, they can turn into trade pieces, or they might just end up being waiver wire fodder if they just don't pan out. Some stashes, I'd say most stashes don't pan out, but it is what it is. Utility players, these are guys that are startable assets for competitive teams, but don't really make sense for you, especially when you're looking at the long term. So they don't offer much as a piece worth building around, as opposed to being one of the pieces that are built around core players to begin with. These are typically flex-worthy players, but aren't players who will crack your top 2 starting spots most weeks, good weeks, outside of buys, injuries, and so on and so forth. Trade pieces in this case are going to be players that just don't necessarily fit the time frame of this rebuilding team, but are valuable to other teams in your league. These are typically going to be utility players, as previously mentioned, or aging vets that are still producing, that are still valuable, like the Adam Thielen we mentioned before, DeAndre Hopkins. Michael Thomas is kind of in that boat, just not to that same extent right now. And then lastly, waiver wire fodder. You need to know this. You need to know what players just aren't necessarily worth keeping anymore, but you have them, you have the roster space, you may as well fill it with something. If you don't have somebody on the waiver wire that you're dying to add, you may as well just hold them and see what happens, because you never know when DeMarcado is going to pop off and do something in a week, and you could trade him for a 3rd round pick. You never know when something like that's going to happen. So, but we need to have these guys isolated, because at any point you may need to free up that roster space to go get that sexy waiver wire ad of the week that you can look to flip for picks later. These are players that just haven't really panned out and no longer hold much of, if any, trade value. And knowing when to cut these roster cloggers is a massive advantage at the end of the day, because in a rebuild, you need to have flexibility. You need to be able to, like I said, make these waiver wire additions when they become popular. And because that's, in my opinion, the best thing to always do with your fab is to, yeah, it's great to add a player that can start for you if you're a competitive roster. But if you're a rebuilding team, what I'm doing with fab is more often than not trying to add the sexy ad of the week and then flip that for picks. Sometimes it pans out where they're a player who, hey, these guys are actually going to be something. And I wouldn't call that a regular thing unless you're in really shallow dynasty leagues. Some people are, and that's okay. We're not here to league shame or anything like that. But allocate what player is what to your rebuild and go from there. Let that kind of be your guide, one of your early compasses to start your rebuild and get you going. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to dive in or dive into your next strategy.
It's very important. I think the first thing that you said is very important. Like, know what your process is and how you're going to get to where you want to get, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we've seen these roster reviews where it's just, oh, I have 10 first-round picks. It's like, oh, that's great. But like, how's that working out for somebody in 2023? How's that working out for drafting Gibbs and JSN and Quentin Johnson and Dalton Kincaid? Like, it's not working out right now. As a matter of fact, they're probably top 3 in lowest max PF right now for their league. So
good for 24 though.
Yeah, but like, we want to at some point we want to get out of that process,
right? We want to turn around,
right? Like, we want to get out of that process, and so for me, I think this is a great point. I love this. Like, know what each asset is for. Are you keeping this? Are you trading this? Are you holding this? Are you make sure that each player and asset on your team has a final destination, whether it's on your team or whether it's not. But for my next point, Bob, I always talk about this. I love talking about this. I love doing this. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be honest with you. This doesn't always work. And you have to be okay with that. You have to know going into this that you're taking a risk. These are the risks I will take in fantasy football, because I'm buying typically a player at a much lower price than I would be able to. And when we could take this even further, right? It doesn't have to just be injuries. It could be players in bad situations, right? So I like buying injured players that fit the timeline of my rebuild. And I'll extend this to not even injured players, but like, let's give you Garrett Wilson this year, right? He's not injured, but his value took a hit when Aaron Rodgers went out for the season. So can I buy a Garrett Wilson at a cheaper price than I would normally be able to? But for now, I'll stick to just the injuries point, right? We're operating here assuming that most leagues should be using reverse max PF for draft order. So the idea here, right, is, do you have players on your roster that don't fit your timeline of the rebuild, and you can move to another team for a player that got injured? A great example I saw of this a few weeks ago was a team, same team that's name built for 2025. They traded Isaiah Pacheco for Nick Chubb. Now, this is great in my opinion, because the ceiling of Isaiah Pacheco is never going to be the ceiling of Nick Chubb, even off a reconstructed knee. I really just, I will never say that Isaiah Pacheco's ceiling is higher than Nick Chubb's ceiling, right? But more so, this gets points off of the roster now and gives me no points this year, which is the goal. I'm not trying to score points as a rebuilding team. So I just moved points for no points, and I didn't use any draft capital to take a shot at a player next year that can potentially help me for a championship run. These are like, I did this with Cooper Kupp last year. I bought a lot of shares of Cooper Kupp when he was injured. And it was a risk. And it's like, you and I went back and forth on this in our Discord, because I was like, man, I think this is a great opportunity to buy Cooper Kupp at a price. Like, the first game back, his value goes up, and it's back up. It's not where it was, but it's way higher than where it was 6 months ago, 5 months ago,
Right.
4 months ago, so on and so forth. The thing that's really important here, Bob, is I would not do this at the expense of draft capital. I think the perfect example is the one I provided, trading a player that doesn't necessarily fit my long-term rebuild. Isaiah Pacheco, he's great, but he can be replaced next year. They can draft another running back in the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th round. They can get another undrafted guy, and he's a threat. You know, this offseason, it was Deneric Prince, and that's to fruition. But that's never going to end. Isaiah Pacheco, until he gets a contract extension that locks him in for 3 or 4 years, is never secure in his role with the Kansas City Chiefs. So for that reason, I think this is a great move. So Bob, I love buying players at an injury dip. They fit the timeline. Like usually my timeline is 1 year. I'm not a big like 2-3 year rebuilder unless I'm taking over a team that's playing guys that aren't playing at all.
Right.
And using them to, for the most part, fit the timeline of my rebuild. You know, you could make the argument that, hey, I'll buy this injury player to flip them next year, but I don't typically do that. I buy these players because I want to make a championship run with them in a year or two from now.
I don't disagree with the concept at all. I think just finding values any way you can is just great practice. So I would say with that specific deal, I think you could honestly try to tack on a third along with Nick Chubb, because I think people on Nick Chubb right now are just jumping ship as much as they can, as quick as they can. And if you had Nick Chubb, I hope you were a competitor coming into the season. I think Pacheco is a nice replacement for this year, but I think Pacheco is worth around a 2nd-round pick. I think Nick Chubb is probably worth a little less than that in the market, with the fear that, you know, and I don't necessarily believe he's going to be what he was. But I still think that Nick Chubb, pretty dang good running back when healthy. So we'll see what happens. But either which way, love the mindset. The Cooper Kupp did pan out so far. I know it's only been 1 game. It'll be 2 games by the time you're watching. But Cooper Kupp was a solid ad. And I think just keeping an eye out and opening up yourself to some risk at opportune costs and times and values. That's the big takeaway here, is when you can, you know, because this is one of those moves. If Chubb were to pan out, you know, just operating in this specific scenario, you know, the value Chubb goes up the second he's back and has a good game, probably to the equivalent or more than Isaiah Pacheco right away. Or if you're turning the corner sooner rather than later, Nick Chubb is a viable asset for you now on a starting roster. Just definitely things to think about. But moving on to things to think about, identifying trade targets that make sense for our rebuild. Nick Chubb might make sense if you are a team not looking to compete for the rest of this year and you can get him at a decent value. Just something to think about. But specifically, not necessarily talking Nick Chubb, but wasting time adding players that won't make sense for our rebuild will only inhibit the progress of our rebuild. So some targets that don't really make sense, aging veterans that just won't outlast the rebuild. You're just sinking value into players that won't help you later. When we add players to a rebuilding roster, we want them to not only outlast the rebuild, but we also want them to help us after the rebuild is complete. We don't just want them to get us 2 years or a year and then, okay, I need you, but okay, now you're deteriorated and old and not worth using for anything. So same deal with running backs. Running backs have proven to be an incredible volatile position from the aspect of value. You can't rely on the investment price to increase for most running backs. Not always the case for injured running backs. You know, we've seen over the last couple of years, some injured running backs, nice little dip. You get to buy them low, and then they, you know, peak back up. So the other thing I'm not looking to add if I am looking at trade targets is the top shelf assets. I don't necessarily want to add, especially at the start of the rebuild specifically. I don't want to add a Patrick Mahomes. I don't want to add a Justin Jefferson. I don't want to add a Jamar Chase. I don't want to add these guys. These guys are awesome for a rebuild if you already have them on your roster. But paying up for these guys on a roster that's just starting a rebuild, with what I expect to be, if you're starting a rebuild, you don't have a lot of assets to work with. You haven't built up that draft capital pool. You haven't built up a pool of assets to just do whatever you want with and pay reasonable prices for. But just spending the assets that you may or may not have to add one of these players won't fix your team. One of these guys is not going to fix your team, and your rebuild isn't going to be over. And if your team is that bad where you need to rebuild, you might be moving early picks for these guys. And it's one thing to move like 3 mid to late first for a Mahomes, Justin Jefferson, or Chase. But if these picks end up early, I mean, you're giving away elite talent, even if it's staggered out for 3 years. Just something to think about at the end of the day. I want more ammo in the chamber when I'm in the starts of my rebuild specifically, but targets that do make sense, focusing on positions and players with insulated value and value that is more likely to rise over the next coming season or two. Something you've discussed with startup draft strategy is targeting players who are just more likely, rookies specifically. Guys last year like Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave were being drafted in the late 20s of startup drafts. Now they're top 10 to 15 guys in this year's startup. Not every situation is going to work like that, but that's kind of the concept that you want to aim for when you're buying players in a rebuild. You want guys that are going to increase in value, not decrease. So these positions should primarily be quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends, running backs. You're going to talk about it a little bit later, but just not super reliable to build around specifically. Better used as secondary or utility assets to work around your core of players. But avoid quarterbacks and tight ends that are 30 or older, as well as wide receivers 27 or older. Again, we want to outlast the rebuild and then utilize these players for some time after the rebuild, not just, I don't really want to add players that are only going to be good for 1 year beyond the rebuild. That's, as good as the value might be, unless you want to play Dynasty Flipper and try to get these guys at a lower cost and then flip them for more later. That's not usually a game I like to play because it's a tricky game to play. You might not get a ton of return, might not really be worth the move. And adding these players might also put points on your roster that you don't necessarily want and could hurt your draft pick. But this rebuild will take time at the end of the day. We want to make sure that we're not adding players who won't outlast the rebuild, and we want to be adding players who will be useful for a couple years beyond the rebuild, or at least, more than one season is the dream. If you can get 2 years out of a player that outlasted the rebuild. I'm also, unless they're a core player like a Garrett Wilson, one of these top 10 wide receivers now, if they're one of those, I'm not necessarily married to these guys long-term either. So that's something to think about too is, I think strapping yourself to one player, assuming they're going to be a 4-year fix, may not be the best process. But if I am targeting a position, wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends is where I'm at. Zach, feel free to dive in or dive on into your next point.
Definitely talk about this a little bit later with one of my other points, but I like this. There's an element of, depending how long the rebuild is, like I want to root for some players, like players I was hyper targeting last year in drafts were Kendre Miller, Jonathan Mingo, Michael Wilson, Puka Nacua in later rounds, because they fit that mold of everything you just described, right? They fit the timeline of my rebuild. I think they will be ascending when I'm ascending, and I think they will outproduce their ADP a year from, whenever your draft was. So that's a big thing of my rebuild, is like finding players that I just like their profile. I feel good about their situations, that they will be ascending when I'm ascending as well. So I love this point. I totally agree with it. And it flows into my next one, because this is one I talk about quite a bit. I'll never not talk about this because it's really important. And it's one of the difference makers for a lot of people. It's the reason why I feel like I just did a trade with Nate this week in one of our other leagues, not the league that you're in, where I traded for a Travis Kelce, and I gave him draft picks and stuff like that. And he was trying to get my young guys, my Puka, my Michael Wilson. I'm like, and he was trying to get my 3rd and 4th round picks. I said, I'm good at drafting late. Like I don't want to give these picks because I'm good at. I gave him a 2nd round pick, but he wanted a 3rd. I'm like, I actually like drafting in the 3rd round because I'm pretty good at it, actually. Sure. And for me, the reason is I'm usually not studying how you guys study, which we're working on, but studying the strengths and the weaknesses of the incoming draft classes, because I got to know how to shape my rebuild around the incoming draft class. For example, the 2024 rookie class, Bob, is very strong at wide receiver, or so it appears on paper. There are a lot of determining factors and variables that can change, right? So what I'm doing right now, if I'm in a rebuilding team, I'm hyper targeting quarterbacks and tight ends, probably more so tight ends, because besides Brock Bowers, the class is mid right now. Running backs, we still have a long way to go in determining the strength of it, but there's no, it doesn't seem like there's a Breece Hall. There's definitely no Bijan Robinson in this class for sure. So I'm shaping my rebuild somewhat around that. And I'll talk about that later because that talks about running backs. But I want to make sure that I am not too strong at a position that the incoming draft class is hyper strong in, because now I'll have a surplus of draft picks, whereas I don't need the players for that. Now you could turn that into something else, but I'm not the guy that trades to keep trading. I'm not the trade flipper, as you said before. I trade with a goal in mind, and it's usually not, let me trade for this draft pick to trade around draft time. So I'm studying the strengths and the weaknesses. How do you do that? You don't have to watch film. I think we've had a couple videos out the last Mondays on wide receivers in the draft class, running backs in the draft class. This is really going to start to ramp up in December, January, when we start talking about the running back class. But get in our Discord. We have a 2024 draft page where people will just have conversations about draft prospects, and that's a way that what's coming in terms of adding youth and players that are going to help you in terms of your rebuild. In previous points, Bob, we've made sure to look for assets to build around that you may not get help from the incoming draft class. And so that's why I like throwing this one in there, because I got to know, I think this is also a decent year for quarterbacks as well. We've got obviously the two guys. Then we could talk about a Michael Penix Jr., a Bo Nix, and so on and so forth. But you want to know what you're going to be looking at in the draft class so I can shape my roster around that, Bob.
Yeah, I love this point. I think this is a good one to call kind of playing Tetris. If you've ever played Tetris, you kind of want to have the opening wherever that next strength of the draft class is dropping. I think that's just a great way to kind of wrap your head around it. And I think another thing you touched on that was a really good point early in your point was, you were able to acknowledge that you were good at drafting players late. And I think that just knowing your own strengths and kind of catering your rebuild to that, like we kind of discussed at the beginning with the opening discussion of just know what you're good at, roll with that, and then try to just supplement other strategies for, if you're not great at navigating trade values, the best way to do that is, kind of working with what you have, and then you have to be good at drafting if you're not good at navigating trade values. So, or you need to be good at finding ways to just get a ton of draft picks at good value if you're not good at drafting, and be able to take as many shots as you have to, kind of take the shotgun approach. So I just think knowing your own strength is a huge point here too, along with the strengths and weaknesses of the coming class. It looks pretty good all around. It looks pretty shallow at tight end. In terms of high end value, we have a couple guys that are pretty outside of Bowers. We have a couple guys that are pretty solid, but I mean, it's a far cry from Brock Bowers, but Jatavian Sanders out of Texas is the one really good tight end to look at that I like a good bit. But moving on, talking about how to get some of these younger players and picks on your team, the number one strategy I really have for trading in general, especially applies to a rebuild, is chasing plus assets on all returns. Anytime you're making a trade, try to find a way to get plus assets in return, unless it's a clear and obvious tier up trade where, you're going from, let's say, if you were hypothetically going from Amon-Ra St. Brown to Justin Jefferson, obviously you have to pay more on top of Amon-Ra St. Brown to get to Justin Jefferson. Obviously on those, you're not going to be able to chase plus assets. The other team would be getting plus assets. But ultimately, in a rebuild, you need opportunities. And when you get more assets in return, whether it's draft picks or players or multiple players or a pick and a player, one of the best ways to isolate more opportunities, as many opportunities as possible, is you're adding additional draft capital and getting more pieces in return than what you're sending in a trade. This is just a great way to diversify your entire roster with one move, and doing this repetitively is what leads to that big abundance of assets that later we utilize to buy players like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Patrick Mahomes. So do this first, do that later when you're ready to come out of that rebuild. And you'll touch on that a little bit later. But putting this into practice, this is simple. Anytime you're in trade negotiations and dealing with counters, and look for situations where you can add an additional draft pick to your return, even if it's just a third round pick. If you're on Sleeper and you're working in the trade proposal tab, you'll be able to see what players are on their trade block. If you can find players that make sense for your rebuild, or that you feel like you can weasel into this trade that you can get more value out of later, do it. Take the chance, take the shot, counter getting that little bit plus extra back. One of my favorite returns of chase, and this will always be my go-to when I'm in a rebuild, if I can't chase multiple picks, or even if I can, I'm going to try to chase a pick and a player or a prospect specifically, a young player. The reasoning for this is you not only gain draft cap, but you also get to add a somewhat known asset. You get to add an asset that's already in the league. You already kind of know the situation. You know what they're dealing with for the next several years or next year or two at minimum. But the little known benefit further to this is how these two assets play well into long-term success and long-term sustainability. As both assets mature, your current player in the league, so the player you get that was already in the league, start scoring points and becoming a viable asset to yours or someone else's starting roster. So you can use them to trade. You can use them to start in your lineup if you're at that point. Meanwhile, that draft pick becomes a player. And while that player is developing, you have that original player who's starting to put up points. So see what you're doing there is you're staggering out development. And you're starting that, what Nate has mentioned as kind of like a Ferris wheel approach of where you have one player coming up and then you have another player coming up behind him slowly but surely. And then when one player is about to go downward, you have another player behind him ready to pick up the pace behind that player as they, eventually, reach that cliff and go downward in their developmental trajectories. Also, when you add a player and a draft pick, you have to wait a little less on development to come, because when you're a rebuilding team, you want production eventually and you need development to happen in the meantime. So when you add a player, as opposed to just 2 draft picks 2 years out or whenever it is, whenever you're getting the draft picks, you're getting to kick off that production trend that much sooner, at least ideally a year sooner than what you might be getting out of a draft pick. And this is one of those things that can help get you out of a rebuild faster, as opposed to just trading for draft picks all the time. This is one of those moves that gets you out of a rebuild faster. If you're playing in cash leagues, most of us are, that's the one thing you want to get out of your rebuild faster. You don't want to be donating to the league for any longer than you have to. Obviously, there's always the consideration that this draft pick is also utilized in other ways, such as trading away, trading up in a draft, but same with the prospect, as we mentioned. But this is why chasing picks and prospects is so powerful, because it diversifies how you can approach things, as opposed to, well, I just got to draft people now, or whatever the case is. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, or feel free to dive into your next point. Like I said, this is one of my favorite points in all trading strategies, getting that multiple return on asset investments, or divestments, I guess you could say, when you're moving players, whatever the case. I'm sure there's a better term for it. But Zach, thoughts?
Yeah, I like this one. And you definitely introduced this one into my main frame of dynasty play, because when you look at a trade in hindsight, 2-3 years from now, you may have won. But at the moment that trade was made, while it does benefit your trajectory, you usually lose that trade. Like if I'm trading Isaiah Pacheco for Nick Chubb, yeah, that trade works for my trajectory, but I'm losing that trade because I'm getting no points now. Now, again, that's no context of do I want points or I not want points, but just on surface value alone, I am losing that trade because I'm trading for a player who will not score points. So typically, and that's the way I sell this, I usually have to say, hey, listen, I'm going to take the time to see if this player works out or XYZ. You're getting these points now. I'm not. I need that extra 3rd or 4th round pick. So it's definitely a strategy that's worked for me. Like I said, I like getting those late 3s and 4s because they're dart throws at players that can really outperform their ADP. And it's a fantastic point. It's probably the number 1 strategy on this list, because that is how you turn a rebuilding team into a championship contender. Because eventually you take 10 dart throws, 1 is going to hit the bullseye. It's going to happen. Sure. So the more dart throws you have, and the reason why I'm saying dart throws in here is because typically you're asking for a 3rd or a 4th round pick, in these trades. It could even be a 5th round pick. You never know. The more opportunities you have, the more chances you have at getting the Amon-Ra St. Browns, the Puka Nakuas, the Isaiah Pachecos, the players who are just not on your radar at the time of the draft, and then become a part of the dynasty community that we all play in. So, but my next point, Bob, this is going to be a little bit controversial, and that's fine with me. I don't build around running backs, man. I'm not a risk taker. I hate missing in Dynasty Fantasy Football, right? And we're in a volatile running back landscape in not only Dynasty, but fantasy football. It's an ever-changing quicksand-like atmosphere where values ebb and flow for running backs more so than any other position right now. Like in the offseason, Bob, you couldn't sell Jonathan Taylor. You couldn't sell Travis Etienne. You couldn't sell Josh Jacobs. Like it was impossible And even so now, you are more capable of trading those players, but are you getting appropriate value to where running backs were getting 3, 4, 5 years ago? No. It is a very, very crazy place where we're at with the running back market / landscape. There's a lot of videos on like how to manage the running back position on a championship contending team, like because you typically want to build around those wide receivers now as opposed to those running backs. So I am not building any rebuilding team around running backs. I will not do it. I refuse to do it. And more so because of the volatility of that position. Like let's take a Todd Gurley, for example, right? Signs a mega contract, disappears a year later. I don't want to be stuck in that position. There's a lot of running backs that you could look at. Like look at James Robinson 2 years ago. Look at Cam Akers right now. They have lost tremendous value in just the last year or so from where they were at certain points in their career trajectory. So I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want any part of that. So as a rebuilding team, it is the last position I focus on. Now, does that mean I'm ignoring running backs in draft process? And so no. I'm not doing that. But like a good example is Rachaad White, right? I think when he came out of the draft, he was 23 years old. I'm not touching Rachaad White on a rebuilding team because in 2 years, he's 25. He tears an ACL. It's over. It's over for Rachaad White's career in terms of the NFL. I do like to get those younger running backs. Breece Hall, 20 years old when he came out. Kendre Miller, 21 years old when he came out. And
I believe he was 20 when he was drafted.
20 when he was drafted. And you can tell me more about this kid from Wisconsin that's coming out, Braylon Allen. He's 19 right now. So but that works with my timeline, right? When they're 22 years old and in the prime of their running back career, I'm just getting to the peak of my rebuild. So those are running backs that I will target. But I look at rebuilding teams as like a layer of cake, and running backs for me are just the cherries on top. That's it. Like I'm putting the batter on. I'm putting the icing around the cake, and then I'll get the running backs. Boop, boop, right on the top. And I'm just not investing heavily in running backs. And you look at the landscape now with just how many injuries there are. Look at the names that are on waiver wires now, and there's a reason that they're popular. The Keontae Ingrams, Amari DeMarcados. There's a bunch of them. I'm not even thinking about. Those are just the two right off the top of my head. But this is the last piece of my rebuild. I'll get quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers first. And then I'll finish off the rebuild with running backs. I see a lot of teams build around, their Kenneth Walker, and then Zach Charbonnet gets drafted. They build around Jahmyr Gibbs, and then he's not a real thing. Don't hate me. I'm just the messenger.
I think right now the big issue with running back, and you touched on this, is the volatile landscape of value. And there's just no insulated value here. And insulated value is something we touched on a few times in the video. Some of you may understand the term, may not. Basically just value that's going to stay put, value that's not going to go ballistic in 3 weeks if there's, a fancy new name popping up out of nowhere, so on and so forth. Or a name that's going to drop dramatically because of, Cam Akers situation. He was probably a top 20 running back on pretty much wherever you looked coming into the season, in terms of dynasty. And I'd be shocked if he's a top 40 guy now. And that's just after a couple weeks, or a handful of weeks, I guess, at this point. But that's a good example. And I think that the best thing to do with running backs, like you said, is focus on them last and draft them, because drafting a running back is probably the cheapest you're ever going to get most running backs, unless you're buying on a discount. And buying at a discount is tricky, because if you bought Breece Hall at a discount, great. If you bought Javonte Williams at a discount, that hasn't panned out yet. Not to the effect that anybody's wanted it to. Same with J.K. Dobbins. And unfortunately, another injury came up. So he just hasn't been able to really get, lucky enough to have a healthy enough season. But running backs are a tricky, fickle mistress, best left to the last year of your rebuild, the last thing you focus on when you are in a rebuild or coming out of a rebuild. Just something to more than likely avoid along the way. Moving on to a point that I like to call value farming. What the heck is value farming, Bob? Value farming is the intentional act of seeking out and finding ways to create value. As a rebuilding team, you are going to need to find every method you can to create and add value to your roster. That's how you're going to eventually work out of a rebuild. Because if you just keep rolling with what you got and relying on draft picks to get you where you're going, it's not going to happen. You need to add additional draft picks. You need to move off of certain players. You need to do this, that, and the other thing. Some things to put into practice if you are value farming, turning waiver wire pickups, using fab, turning that into draft capital like we discussed already, using buy sell windows to maximize value, buying the dips, selling at peaks, buying a Garrett Wilson, for example, like you mentioned earlier, selling players that are at peak value that maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe you don't believe in the peak value. Maybe you believe that this is kind of a farce. Two examples that just kind of pop into my head. I know we like Puka, you and I like Puka Nacua, but I know a lot of people don't. Puka Nacua is probably a name you could shift for Garrett Wilson right now and work off of those two, one being a dip, one being a peak. You might be able to get an interesting trade done there. That's just an example, not necessarily saying something I'm saying to go do. It's just an example of a move you could possibly make involving a buy-sell window that maximizes value for you. Another thing too, moving handcuffs when they're activated, especially as a rebuilding team, you don't want those points on your roster. So move those handcuffs when you can. When they're activated is when they're going to be the most valuable, fortunately enough for you and unfortunately enough for anybody who wants to buy them now. And another thing, paying attention to league mates' interest over time. You know, if they send you a trade offer, remember the player that they had in the trade offer. If they were gunning for the same player that you want on fab waivers, remember that as well. And you might not make a trade that exact day. You might not, do anything right away. You might not be able to send a trade 1-for-1 right away, but you may be able to, maybe you were working on another trade with that player, that dynasty manager, let's say. And now you can utilize a player that they've instilled new value in, or that they've instilled interest in, to facilitate a trade that's a better deal for you, instead of just, swapping fab or maybe a single pick. Maybe you get a nicer player out of it that isn't performing up to standards. Maybe just the player they wanted helps them more now. You can get more help later with draft picks, whatever the case may be. But with the bottom of any rebuilding roster, I'm using it to farm value, trade players that get unnecessary hype when they don't fit your long-term vision, etc. Using, fab waivers. We made a list of players that don't really belong on a roster, that belong more on waivers. Use those players to cut, to add the players that get you draft capital for fab. Just every little way that you can extrapolate more value out of the roster you have and create value in additional draft picks and assets. The more assets you have, the more you can just do with your roster entirely. The more you can make tier up trades, the more you can trade up in drafts, the more you can do anything. Draft capital is the ultimate currency in Dynasty in general. Everybody loves draft capital. Not everybody's going to love every player. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on value farming. If you have any thoughts, otherwise feel free to dive into your next point.
It's a great point. It's something that really can move your timeline faster than you expected, because and this goes with a lot of the other points, like getting the plus assets in return, plus value farming. They really can make a difference. If a couple years ago you may have been in a rebuilding situation and you traded for Amon-Ra St. Brown, you're in a very good spot right now. Like I remember I actually in a rebuilding situation, I traded 2 4th-round picks for Amon-Ra St. Brown. This is when he was doing nothing the first 10 weeks. And I'm like, let me send these 4th-round picks for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And dude, the glow up on Amon-Ra St. Brown, that trade lives in infamy in that league. And it's like, well, he was worth that when I traded for him.
Yeah.
Right. But what is a 4th-round pick at the end of the day really worth? Can I get a player that could outperform a 4th-round pick in a year or two from now? That's what I was trying to do there. I didn't think he was going to blow up to what he is now.
Right.
So you got to look for these situations where you can turn lesser value into greater value, or you capitalize on that greater value, like an Amon-Ra St. Brown or a Puka Nacua. So great point by you. For me, Bob, we've touched on all these points. I talked about in the beginning, letting everyone know that you're open for business. But for me, I always seal the contending kiss with a big trade. I gotta let everyone know we open for business now for vets. I'm buying a lot of leagues last year. We bought David Montgomery. We bought Mike Evans. We are living right now off of those trades. And listen, I'm somebody that when you come in my inbox, make sure you're not wasting my time. Make sure that your offer works with my timeline. And if not, I will ask you, why would I want Mike Evans on this team that I'm clearly not competing? I will put you on the spot in terms of your trade offer in my inbox, and that can rub some people the wrong way. And I'm okay with that because I want to hear your thought. Like, how does this trade make sense for me? So I want to let everyone know, hey, I'm in it now. I'm here to compete. And for me, I keep using this example. That was Cooper Kupp for me last year because Cooper Kupp wasn't cheap still, even after being injured. Now, he was cheaper than what he was prior to the injury, where he was wide receiver 1 after like 8 games. But nonetheless, like, people knew once I bought Cooper Kupp, oh, this man is going for it next year. And for me, that's like, I've done these 8, 9, 10 steps. Now I'm here, and I am no longer a rebuilding team. I want teams to know, hey, I'm interested in your David Montgomerys, your Mike Evans. We don't know who those guys are going into the 2024 offseason because last year David Montgomery wasn't like so cheap during the season. In the offseason, David Montgomery was almost free, and so was Mike Evans. It was ridiculous, and we talked about that on the channel quite a bit. But you want to let teams know that, hey, I don't want your draft picks anymore. I don't want your Kendre Millers. I don't want your Jonathan Mingos. I want your David Montgomerys. I want your Mike Evans. Come to me for that kind of stuff from now on. So for me, like I said, I talked about in the beginning, letting the league know when I'm rebuilding, and I'm letting the league know when I'm going for it by making it doesn't have to be like a Justin Jefferson, but make it a move that people understand. Like, we are out of the rebuilding phase. We are in the contending phase, and I'm open for business for these moves.
I think that's I love this concept, and I love that it's kind of full circle. Hey, I'm rebuilding, but now watch out, I'm going for your championship, my championship, let's say. And I think it's just good for your mindset to make a move that says, you know what, we're turning the corner. Because one of the biggest mistakes, and we'll probably talk about this next week, I know we've talked about it previously.
Yes.
One of the biggest mistakes in rebuilds is just rebuilding forever and never turning the corner. But this is one move, one strategy that, you know what, it's time. Now you make a move that kind of commits you further into competing and gets you out of a rebuild. Cooper Kupp is a prime example because you should not touch Cooper Kupp unless you are a competitive team. And if you have him already, or if you have him currently and you are a rebuilding team, it's time to flip him. He would be in the trade pieces category if you were to make that list I suggested earlier. Furthermore, to signify when you're ready to make this move, getting into my last quick point, start piecing together your long-term lineup. As you're going through all of your moves, we talked about this a couple weeks ago on the channel, start piecing together that long-term lineup. Look at, as often as you can, make a lineup. Just set your lineup of what you believe your roster looks like in 1 to 2 years. A year from now, if you were to, realistically look at the players that you want to keep on your roster that are young enough that are going to outlast this rebuild, make a lineup. Use this as a compass. This can help you understand how much further there is to go in your rebuild and may help you adjust your focus if you need to focus on adding a quarterback, wide receiver, tight end, etc. And it'll help you be mindful of opportunities that may arise in your league when players are, hey, man, I have Garrett Wilson, but Garrett Wilson isn't helping me win a championship this year. What pieces do you have? Are you that rebuilding team that happen to have Cooper Kupp kicking around? You can facilitate a trade there, not saying 1 for 1, but just something along those lines. Can you be that pharmacy that helps with the wounds we mentioned earlier? But, it's simple. Take the time weekly, monthly, as often as you can. Set what you expect to be that long-term starting lineup that you're building toward. Utilize your core players that you're planning on building around. And the biggest thing to do is don't force players in that you don't honestly expect to be long-term solutions. Allow gaps to exist, because this is what kind of can help tell you where to go and what you need to do, where you can afford looking ahead next year to next year's rookie draft. Like you mentioned earlier, this, can afford or can show you where you can afford to have lineup gaps exist. And if you have the draft picks then to make those gaps close, if you can fill in those gaps with those draft picks, this will honestly help provide a ton of clarity and direction, especially as to how much longer the rebuild should take and which players or positions to target next. Zach, any closing points before we get out of here?
Yeah, I think that our 2 points there really close off this list here where and I really appreciated what you talked about, like changing your mindset, because like I said, we've seen a lot of roster reviews, Bob, where it's like you're just in the same cycle you were in a year ago, clearly, because people send us the moves they made. It's like, oh, I traded Brees Hall for this. Like, you don't have to trade Brees Hall. Like, and it's getting into that mindset where it's like veterans are not evil. They're not the enemy. At some point, you have to be okay with like, okay, Julio Jones is no longer a thing. Like, you have to be okay with that, and you have to you minimize your risk to that. But like last year, I bought a couple of shares of Tom Brady, and I'm like, is probably not coming back for another year, but like, and you minimize your risk by not offering like a first round pick. I'm obviously not offering a first round pick for Tom Brady. So, but like you just winning a championship pays for your league dues for the next decade, changing your mindset from this, I'm rebuilding, I'm going young, to now, oh, I'll buy your Terry McLaurin's, your Mike Evans, so on and so forth. And putting that lineup together and seeing that lineup, it really changes your mentality, because you're no longer a rebuilding team. You've gone in now, you're making a push, and be patient with that push too, right? Like there are teams that right now that are 3-2 and they're frustrated. It's like, dude, you're fourth in max PF in the league. Maybe set a better lineup. Or if you're doing best ball, I'm fourth in points for. Like, just be patient with the process. You're not supposed to be in first and second place every single week in your league. The landscape is changing with injuries and so on and so forth. So we're only a third or a fourth of the way through, or sorry, half of the way through the season. So be patient with that process. But that point that you talked about, Bob, that mentality of like seeing yourself become from going from a rebuilding team to now, you all have to compete with me. I'm going to be a problem. It's really cool, man. Like it is one of the, and that's why I love Dynasty football, because I do love the rebuilding process, but I do love that part where it's like all that stuff that I did in these first 10 steps, you're going to have to deal with now. And hopefully you made some right decisions to turn you into a championship contender.
While that is it for this video today, I do hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What other questions do you have about rebuilding? And of course, like we mentioned, if you need help with rebuilding, head on over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. That link will be in the the pinned comment below, as well as the YouTube description box. If you need help rebuilding, we offer roster reviews to help you get through the rebuilding process. Kind of giving you a step-by-step guide of what we've gone through today. We'll also talk about some things to avoid in that rebuilding process. But that is going to be it for us today. I do hope you all enjoyed. Again, like I said, if you did, consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. But with all of that said, Zach and I will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.